You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Today we're going to be talking about one of our favorite people of all times, Rahm Emanuel. I used the quote that he made when I did my announcement this week. And Rahm Emanuel is famous for saying, don't ever let a good, let's see, now I forgot the quote. Don't ever let a good crisis go to waste when you can do something with it that you never thought you could otherwise do. And so that is exactly what's happened with this COVID-19 thing. And we are learning more and more all the time about the things that are happening from it. And I want to thank our guests today, because I've got Paul Dreesen and David Wojcik are going to be our guests today, and we're going to be talking about how the climate change and the Green New Deal and all these other programs that are coming out of the loony left, how they've been really promoting all the things that they've been talking about while this pandemic's been going on. And they're beside themselves. They keep talking about, well, we'll never go back to the old normal. We better get used to this kind of a society. This society is something that is part of the New Deal. And that is, you're going to be working at home. You're not going to be traveling much. You're going to be isolated from friends and other people. And you're going to be more or less controlled by the state. So with that said, I see, Paul, you're on. Please unmute your microphone there. I'd love to have you come on, and we'll get this program started. Paul Dreesen is a fellow with the, Paul, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of your background? You're an author, you're a researcher, you've been part of the Heritage Foundation, done things for them. You work with Craig Rucker and are doing a lot of really impressive programs. Tell our listeners a little bit more about the stuff that you've been doing.
Yeah, Dan, I want to check and make sure that I'm coming in fine.
Excellent. Yeah.
Good. Well, my background's geology and biology and environmental law. Got time on Capitol Hill, time with the Department of the Interior, onshore and offshore oil and gas leasing, Indian affairs, parks and recreation, all kinds of areas over there at Interior. Been with think tanks for a lot of years now. I've been a video production producer and writer. Been with the think tanks now for the last 20 plus years, working on all kinds of energy and environmental and climate change issues, as well as human rights issues. So very comfortable with all of these topics, getting into the corona issues as just another example of government, as you're saying, government using a crisis to impose more control over our lives. And some members of that ruling elite, Hollywood elite, wanting to extend this corona crisis lockdown in perpetuity almost, wanting to use it as a dress rehearsal, a blueprint for shutting it down in the name of protecting the planet from climate change and ecological catastrophe, without recognizing that the real ecological catastrophe would come from the wind and solar, biofuel, and battery technologies that they want to use to replace fossil fuels and nuclear power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we talked about that yesterday. That's and not to mention that, but hydropower, because many of us here in the West, hydropower from dams that we have in the area are the most efficient, the cleanest, the lowest cost. The best source of electricity in the Western United States is dams. And one of the programs that they're doing under Agenda 21 is the destruction of over 6,000 dams scattered all over the United States. Many of those, in fact, the majority of them are actually producing power. So, yeah, it's crazy what they're doing. You're absolutely right.
Well, one of the things that I've been getting into is just an analysis of how many wind turbines onshore or offshore or solar panels and batteries it would take if we were going to replace all the fossil fuel and nuclear power here in the United States and have backup power for all those hours and days and maybe sometimes a week on end where there's no sunshine or no wind, plus making up all the power that's currently going into internal combustion engines or factories that are run on natural gas, homes that are heated by natural gas, and replacing all of that also with wind and solar and battery backup. And if you were going to do that and account for the fact that you have all these windless and sunless days, or there's not enough wind, or there's too much wind for those to operate, you've got winter time, you've got nighttime, where the wind and the sun are not as good as they are other times of the year, for example. So if you're going to replace all that energy with wind turbines, we would need something on the order of 6 million onshore wind turbines, each one 1.8 megawatts. And that would blanket about 75% of the United States with wind turbines and associated transmission lines. If you were going to go and do it all with solar panels, you would need something like 40 billion solar panels of the kind that they've got down at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, which track the sun. So you get a lot more use out of those panels per day than something that's stationary. You would need 4 billion half-ton Tesla-style batteries to do that. It's just insane. And none of that stuff just appears magically or with some special effects out of a Hollywood movie. These actually have to be manufactured, and that means they need raw materials, concrete, steel, aluminum, rare earth metals, all kinds of stuff that have to be dug out of the ground. The greenies, the Hollywood people don't want to address any of that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely preposterous. They think this is just going to materialize magically on our planet and everything's hunky-dory. The wind and sun are certainly free and clean and green, but harnessing them to benefit humanity is not at all.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And I hate to say it, but I think AOC and people like Joe Biden exemplify the political intellect that is moving a lot of these programs forward, because quite frankly, they're some of the dumbest people that God ever let live. And everything that comes out of their mouth is complete nonsense. I don't mean to belittle individuals, but the fact is the political class in this country, for the most part, as John Adams said, those who refuse to participate in representative government are bound to be led by their inferiors. It's obvious that not too many people have been participating because we sure got a lot of our inferiors that are leading us right now.
Yeah.
David, I hear you're on. David Wojcik, writer and excellent researcher for CFACT and other groups. David, give our listeners a little bit about you and your background, and I'd like to hear your comments on this stuff.
Okay, good. Yeah, can you hear me okay? Because I'm trying out a new headset.
Actually, it's working very well. Excellent.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see. I have a kind of an unusual background in that I was a civil engineer. In fact, I used to design big dams, so I'm a big fan of your hydro stuff. But then I got a PhD in analytic philosophy of science. And where analytic refers to concept analysis, the whole idea is to, in the philosophical side, is to identify conceptual confusions. So I wound up applying that to public policy. I guess the best way to put it is, if you're in the confusion business, the government is your best bet. So I've been doing regulatory analysis, legal analysis, policy analysis for a very long time. I drifted into the climate thing about 28 years ago. So I've been tracking that and writing about it and cataloging confusions and fallacies, of which there are quite a few. Then when the COVID thing came along, I started looking at that. I do want to say ahead of time that I know nothing about medicine and very little about biology as far as that's concerned. Paul can have that side. But I know a lot about policy confusions, okay? And we've got and I think there's no doubt, at least I hope no one would claim that there's no confusion in the COVID thing. It has been a mess. And I'm going to be keying today, kind of my framework is an article that I wrote, which CFACT published about 2 weeks ago. And it's the title is A Tale of Two Panics, COVID and Climate. It turned, I'm sure. The whole COVID thing is a panic. Okay, the public is panicked, and there are reasons for that. I want to look into it, and the government is responding to that panic by making some very bad decisions. But the climate change thing is also a panic. The difference is primarily one of scale, time scales. Okay, the COVID thing is we're looking at months to years, hopefully not too many years. In climate, we're talking about decades, since people are passing laws for zero carbon in 2050, and we've been at it for 30 years. That's already 60 years. So the scales are completely different, but from my observation and my theoretical work, they're very similar, very similar. And it's what I lay out in some briefly in the article. But I'd like to talk about, first of all, those similarities, and then talk about what we might be able to do to keep this from happening again.
Okay, go ahead with that, David. I agree with you. This is all we hear anymore is panic, 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 and there's so little common sense in any of this. I'd love to have you address this because this is really important.
Well, let me give you the basic thing is what do we call in communication theory a cascade, and that's where something causes something bigger to happen, that causes something bigger to happen, and that causes something bigger to happen. So something really quite small turns out to have a monstrous impact. And in both the cases of climate and COVID, the small thing were some hyperbolic computer models. Okay. I wouldn't really pay in much. Well, we all know, I think, that the climate thing is completely model driven. And in fact, USA Today just did a story. I just did an article that was published today. USA did one about how 3 billion people in 2070 are going to, where they live now is going to be uninhabitable. It's going to look like the Sahara Desert. Well, there's a good example. That's a computer output, okay, and that's the kind of thing that can panic people. In the COVID thing, it was Ferguson, and the death estimate for the U.S. of 2.2 million. In fact, I, like probably a lot of people, wasn't paying very much attention to the COVID thing until the New York Times came out and told me that 2.2 million Americans were going to die. And I said, whoa, right? Now, what happens is, in both cases, the climate case and the COVID case, you get these hyperbolic model results, and then the press picks up on them and makes a big story out of it. Okay, so now all of a sudden you've gone from one person to millions of people reading stuff. Okay, so the press is the second step. When they blow these things out of proportion, the next thing that happens is people get upset, people panic, and people did. And then the government responds to that. See, this didn't come from the government. Government was responding to the panic in the people who were responding to the panic in the press, who were responding to the panic in the computer model. So they're like 4 stages. And I can talk about each of them, and intend to, actually, we've got the time. But the other thing I really want to at some point get around to how to try to keep something like this from happening again. And I do have some ideas on that. Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's the framework.
Well, I think that's an excellent way to approach it. You're absolutely right. The numbers that we've heard, at least originally, the numbers we heard are very, very high. And in fact, the CDC came out earlier this week, and even the CDC indicated that the numbers, the 68,000 deaths through COVID-19 were actually something less than half of that in reality. And we've been hearing from nurses and medical people around the country now that they're being asked to actually tie a lot of the deaths that are normal deaths into the COVID-19 because there's government money there if they can just tie it to COVID-19. And so there's a lot of nonsense here. And obviously, every time the government gets involved, the nonsense level goes way, way up.
Yeah. Well, let's look at bad data for a second, because again, you're going to find there's a really remarkable number of similarities. There's no question that we got bad data over on the climate side. What we have is these attribution studies that are coming out where the people are, again, using computer models and telling us that 58% of Hurricane X was due to global warming, due to human beings. You know, there actually are death tolls now being rung up on the climate side. Now, but watching, I saw exactly the same thing happen in COVID, and there are a couple there. One of them is the death count, and everyone was. The best example of that is Italy and Germany. Okay, Italy was going through the roof in deaths. Germany, I forget it was several thousand, and Germany was showing like a few hundred, and people started wondering what the hell is going on. The Italian government actually did a quick study, and they said that, well, this is a classification problem. They said, we're classifying anybody who dies with COVID as dying from it. And they actually came up with a number. They said, as near as we can tell, this was at the time, only 12% of the reported deaths are actually due to the virus. Now, you take 12% of the Italian number at that time, and by golly, it was very close to the German number. So one of the problems we've got is we've got death data that doesn't make any sense, okay? And we have no reason to believe it because we know that every country's got a different classification system. For all I know, every hospital in America has a different one. Now, there's another data problem, and that is with the number of infections, okay? In most cases, we see these infections start shooting up, and it turns out that this is not an increase in infections, it's an increase in testing. Remember, the testing was very slow to get going. And this is something you can see in all sorts of fields. In the environmental area, this happened with mercury pollution. We developed new tests that enabled us to go from 1 part per billion to 1 part per trillion in finding mercury in water. And all of a sudden, all the waterways in America are polluted with mercury. Well, that's not true. It's just we got a better test, and so we were finding stuff that had always been there. Okay, so here again, you see but the bad numbers are feeding the panic, and there is money in bad numbers.
Yeah.
And capitalism tells us if there's money in bad numbers, you're going to get them.
Yeah. Let me pick up on that just a second, if you would.
Sure.
I think we're mixing mercury and climate and COVID. I want to jump back to COVID and just spend a moment on that and those bad numbers. As you said, it's a question of whether somebody died from corona or they died with corona. And you see that all over in the United States, New York, and so forth. There's, again, the same problem. Everything is being attributed to corona. So if someone has congestive heart failure and they've got diabetes or obesity, or they're 90 years old, or they've got pneumonia, or several of those things in combination in an elder care facility or a hospital, and then they get corona, you can't really say they died from corona. That may have been the final straw on the camel's back, but they've really died from all these other problems, and corona was just the last thing that weakened them further and caused the ultimate death.
Oh, or it may not have weakened them at all. I mean, in nursing homes, people die every day, literally.
Sure,
okay.
Exactly. But then the second half of this that's not discussed right now, and if you try to bring it up, Twitter and some of those other social media sites ban your discussion, and that is the deaths that are to the lockdown, and we're not keeping any track of those, and we're likely to see greater and greater numbers of those kinds of deaths as the weeks and months go by. They may be something as simple as a suicide, someone who's suddenly lost their business, their home, because there's no work for people. They're all being locked down. Their businesses are being shut down. But then in the longer stretch, you've got people who are afraid to go in and get a biopsy, to get their chemo treatment, to have their kids vaccinated, to go in even after a likely stroke or heart attack because they're afraid of getting corona. You've got hospitals and clinics that are just not being shut, that are not being allowed to operate. Mm-hmm. And so they're not allowed to provide a lot of that care. And that also adds to a death toll that's very directly related to corona, but it's really due to the lockdowns. So there's exaggerated death count from the coronavirus, some of it in order to drive the panic or to get the federal funding or whatever, but it's still inaccurate or completely dishonest. And then there's the other half of it where you're just ignoring the other side of this equation, and not just the economics, the unemployment, businesses that are closed or shut down or will never open again, the bankruptcies, but the human health and death effects of all of that. And that also needs to be factored in here, and it's not happening.
No, you're right. Go ahead, David. I was saying, Paul, you're right. Yeah.
You can do the same thing, and of course the same thing happens on the climate change side, where people want, like you said, Paul, you take those numbers of wind turbines and solar panels, and you factor that into the economic impact, the impact on agriculture. Well, actually, how about we don't eat meat, so all the farmers go commit suicide? I'm sorry to put it that way, but go out of business. The whole oil and gas sector goes out of business. You know, plastics. I mean, well, yeah, no one looks at the economic impact of the panic response. They're all looking at the thing that's causing the panic. Okay. I'd like to talk about models for a second, if I can jump in.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I happen by an odd coincidence, I happen to have a little bit of experience with disease models, And that's because they're not just disease models. The proper term for them is actually contagion models. And about 10 years ago, I was working for the Office of Science of the U.S. Department of Energy, and we were interested in how to get more, get our research, their research role. They're the largest funder of basic physical research and computer research in the world, DOE is, and how to get the results out. I actually recruited a team that we used a disease model to try to look at the way in which science is communicated, and if there were ways to improve the communication of science. Okay, the good ideas are also a contagion, right? They go from, one person spreads them. Okay, I'm not getting into those results. The point is that these models, there are at least three things that made the modeling bad. Okay, and this is important to notice the different things, because if we're going to try to keep it from happening in the future, we have to address these are the things we have to address. Okay, one of the problems was, of course, that the model was never released. The guy said he couldn't release it because he'd written it 10 years ago and it had never been documented. But that's not a good reason to believe a model. Okay. In fact, as you may know, over on the environmental side, EPA and now Department of Interior are both looking at what are called secret science regulations. And those regulations prohibit the use of models that cannot be evaluated in making policy. The whole COVID thing is an enormous panic driven by a model that no one's been able to evaluate. Okay, so if we could at least get some principles out there that say, look, if people can't study it and figure out what its weaknesses are, we're not going to make policy on it. But that's exactly what we did. Another thing is that I've actually talked to some modelers about this and dug up some background. That 2.2 million death toll. That was the only data they had at that time was actually out of China, actually just out of Wuhan. And there's one of the rules in at least in the energy world is you don't trust Chinese data. When they tell us what their pollution levels are, what their CO2 emissions are, things like that, we don't trust them. Okay. Secondly, that's an extremely small amount of data. Now, the thing about the disease modeling is a fairly simple thing. It's what's called the S-curve. Right? The thing runs along and it grows very slowly for quite a while. And then it gets to a certain point and it takes off and it goes shooting up. And then it just peters out. It stops at the top and levels off again. And we have the same thing in publications in science. We've known that actually since that's the kind of stuff that I was looking at, that S-curve. These things are everywhere. The point about this is when the thing is starting up, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to say where it's going to go. Okay, it may go way up. It may only go a little way up. Now, what the model with the 2.2 million did was he said, oh, it's going to go way up. I mean, he got that result, but I know that result is extremely sensitive to the input data. Okay, just like the social cost of carbon stuff, computer models. People have shown you change the discount rate a little bit, it completely changes the numbers. You can change the input data on a disease model just a tiny bit, and it will go from 2.2 million deaths to 60,000 deaths. Mm-hmm. Okay, but they didn't say that. Did anybody read and say, well, this is just one possibility and there are a lot of other possibilities which could be extremely small compared to... No. Did the New York Times say that? No. What they said was 2.2 million people are going to die. Okay, that's using a model. That's abusing a model. That's using a model in ways that are completely inappropriate because you're ignoring the weaknesses. You're ignoring the uncertainties. Okay. Now, one possibility, by the way, Pruitt over at EPA, he wanted to have a red team put together to go through and really identify the weaknesses in the climate models. Well, I think it might be a good idea for this government to have a red team policy where anytime any kind of monster result is attributed to a computer model, to have a team take a whack at that model before any policy decisions are made. That's what didn't happen.
I agree. And behind the environmental movement, there's always been this precautionary principle idea that you don't do something not because there's empirical evidence that it's going to have an actual effect. You just don't want to take the chance. And that's exactly what's driven a lot of the climate policy, is this precautionary principle.
No, that's a good.
Oh, well, we're still seeing that in the lockdown. That's the thing that's going to make. If you think it's been crazy until now, wait till you see the lockdowns start to come off. Every state is going to be different. Every town is going to be different. There are going to be people who say, "Oh no, there are hardliners who say that we should be locked down for a year." I think it was Maryland. I'm not sure. One of the states just came out with a draft plan saying we're going to let the kids go back to school next January, okay, as opposed to next September. That's a long time. That's the precautionary principle. This is really going to drive this. No bureaucrat wants to say, okay, it's safe to go out and it's safe to go out and die, because people are going to keep on dying, okay, in small numbers. Right, but we got to put the economy back together. But the hardest thing for a bureaucrat to do is to say, okay, you can go do this, knowing that people are going to die.
Yeah, and that's, David, we're right back to what I was saying earlier. Yep. Just to pick up on your point, the precautionary principle always works in one direction. It's the precaution of avoiding deaths from climate change, for example, or from a chemical, or from industrial process, or from coronavirus, but you never look at the deaths that would be caused from taking away a chemical, or the benefits of using that chemical. You never look at the deaths that are being caused by the lockdown itself, the economic destruction and death, sickness that will go on possibly for years and years as a result of this 6 week, 6 month, a year-long lockdown for coronavirus. And if you don't take those into consideration, and maybe you're going to get hammered more if you ignore the corona deaths than if you ignore the other deaths. But if you don't take those other lockdown deaths into consideration,
we could use a red team. We could use a red team analyzing these lockdown policies. And they would come out and say, well, look, here's our death estimate. Here's what suicides are going to look, because suicides certainly are going to look like for the next 2 years if you go with this policy. And I could build a model that would come up with those numbers. You're right, Paul. I never thought of it that way. It's a one-way street when we're actually in a two-way situation.
Yeah, and you have to look at all the factors. It's a global problem. It's a U.S. problem. You shut down all these businesses, keep people at home. Domestic violence is going to go up. Drug addiction is going to go up. Alcoholism is going to go up. Murder, suicide, deaths from all kinds of illnesses that are not properly treated. Right. An hour in a stroke is going to be golden 10 hours. And that means permanent disabilities and deaths that should not have happened. These are all things that A, are not being discussed, and B, the media and the social media cut you out if you try to bring these things up. And that is a horrific situation for all of us too. Another totalitarian censorship system that we're being forced to accept because we're not fighting it tough enough from my perspective.
Well, yeah, but I like to think we might be able to create a government situation where we used to have a thing called the Office of Technology Assessment many years ago. That was a congressional office, actually. The point I guess I'm thinking of is if you have a red team, blue team thing, where each side is charged with doing the best job they can on each side of the thing, then you're going to get both sides.
Right, but my point
right now, nobody in the government has the responsibility of looking at the downside, do they? I don't know about it.
We may have a red team, blue team a year or two from now, but we need it right now.
Well, I'm looking ahead. Okay, this one's hopeless. Yeah, we did.
Well, I'm going to mention something here because Governor Cuomo is the one that sent all these COVID-19 cases to the assisted living centers, to all these areas where the most vulnerable group of people live in these facilities. And he was sending all the COVID-19 cases there. And then he turns around and opines about how every life is important. So if there's one life that might be lost because of COVID-19, we need to take every precaution there is. I mean, if that isn't a perfect example of how stupid
yes, but insane, I believe, is the actual word in that case. Yeah, that's irrational.
That's
literally irrational.
This is Cuomo and de Blasio, and they compounded that by telling the workers in these nursing homes and so forth that they needed to stay on duty because there weren't enough extra workers. Even if they had coronavirus, they still needed to be there. And then this whole thing about, well, every death counts, every life is important, except the people who are dying from the lockdowns. It is insane, and we need to raise these issues in some forums where they're going to get the attention of the president and these governors, people that are in charge. And here's another aspect of this. According to the Wall Street Journal, about 37% of the American workforce can work from home. That includes the media people, the ruling elites, all these other government people, teachers, and so forth, who can
people like you and me
from home by video conference and so forth, the way we're doing right now. But about 2/3 of the United States, you can't do your job in a restaurant from home or in a factory or all these other places. So 2/3 of the public that are being shut down, locked down, are not making any money. Their economics are being destroyed. And it's the people in the 1/3 that are making the decisions for all of them. And they make 5, 10, 100 times more money per year than the ones that are in the 2/3 majority, but they're making the decisions for the 2/3, and they're not taking any pay cuts. Now, I would like to see a rule coming out from the government that says if you are in that 1/3 and you're a government employee or you're even a teacher, but if you're not on the front lines, you take a 50% pay cut for the duration here. A, because it's fair and equitable, and B, because the progressives are always for fairness and equity and so forth. But the second part of it is the tax revenues are going through the floor.
Way down.
Costs are going through the roof, and this would help offset some of those budget shortfalls. So why is nobody talking about that?
Well, gentlemen, I'd like to make the following hypothesis. If there is any group of people that are unessential workers, I would consider probably government right at the top of that list. Why aren't the other people who, like you say, Paul, that go out and make a living and have to work for a living, they're not being allowed to work, but yet government is somehow essential? I don't think so.
No, it's the other way around, actually. People that work are what is essential.
I mean, some government workers are essentials, and you can count them out. But you've got all those frontline people who are generally working for government in the hospitals and some of these other the first responders, police and firemen and so forth. Those are all government workers. A lot of the people in the hospitals there's county or city hospitals and so forth. Those people are essential in this situation, but boy, I can't say a lot of the media people are essential.
No.
And they certainly shouldn't be picking up $100,000 or $200,000 or a couple $1 million a year for from home, however they're doing it.
Yeah. Well, Congress would be one of those groups that I would consider very unessential. And what we're hearing right now out of people like AOC and, some of the Pelosi and some of the would call them the kingpins of the loony left. Boy, if there's anything unessential, it's them.
Yeah, and if you're talking about AOC and Pelosi, throw in Biden, all three of them said that the ban on air travel to and from China that was imposed at the end of January by President Trump was racist and xenophobic. If they had been in charge, just think how many thousands or tens of thousands more people would have been coming into the United States with coronavirus and COVID, and we'd have 1,000 times more problems than we have today.
Well, so I'm gonna broach a subject here. I really want to hear both you guys' comments on this. But think about this: the elderly are the group of people who are most susceptible to this COVID-19. Okay, they're also, I mean, let's face it. There's a kind of a war against the elderly going on right now because they are supposedly people who are living off the system. They're drawing Social Security, and they're not productive members of society. I think this is really a program being promoted under Agenda 21, under other programs like that, where the elderly are the most susceptible to the disease, and yet at the same time, they're trying to convince people that they no longer matter because they aren't being productive members of society. Now, talk about that. I really want to hear your comments on that.
Well, you'd think of that in the case of New York with de Blasio and Cuomo sending recovering corona patients into the nursing homes instead of off to the Javits Center or to the hospital ship that was anchored right there in New York Hospital. They were basically empty. They had all these personnel there. They had all these beds, all this equipment, the respirators, and they were not using them. Instead, they were sending them to the nursing homes. So you can make a case. I don't know the Neil Malthusian attitudes, the Paul Ehrlich attitude. Well, we got to get rid of.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, a different group entirely. The people who are, the climate change types who think that humans are a curse, are very comfortable with having a generation disappear ahead of time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it really fits. Who else? Who better to take out? Which I guess is your point.
yeah. And yet,
that's why. We are getting. Mark Morano is doing a wonderful job of collecting these stories over at Climate Depot over at CFAC, and there are all these vocal people saying now this is taking us in the right direction. Okay, not just that we're not traveling, and not just that we're dying.
Yeah, and this is just such an outrageous thing to be hearing that you want to round those folks up and put them in someplace in an asylum themselves. The flip side of this, though, of course, is also important, and that is if indeed something like 80 or 90% of the coronavirus deaths are occurring within the nursing homes or among the elder care and very sick populations, why does the rest of the United States need to be locked down? Why do all of the people need to be told they can't go to?
They don't. That's what Sweden proved that they don't.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Sweden proved that the lockdown, this mass lockdown thing, wasn't necessary. They isolated the old people. They isolated, you got a disease coming, certain people are susceptible, isolate those people, protect them.
Yeah, Germany did the same thing, David. Their factories did not shut down. They just practiced social distancing and provided masks right at the beginning. So the Siemens people and all these other factory workers were still working in Germany, though they were being told stay home here in the United States and in Britain and in France. And the death toll in Germany is lower than it is in those other places.
And in Taiwan, it's practically non-existent because they really got on top of it at the beginning. And they didn't even close the schools. They didn't even close the schools. They do have little boxes around the students in the classroom, but that's all. And as soon as they test the hell out of them, and as soon as somebody's tested, then, positive, then they treat them like somebody who's got something that needs to be protected.
Right.
Quarantine is that's always been the concept of quarantine, as opposed to everybody shutting down your society. Okay, you just quarantine the people who are sick.
Yep,
and in this case, protect the people who are most vulnerable from the people who are sick. You don't put them together.
Right, exactly, and you don't shut down the people who are not sick, as opposed to the people who are. But the other thing,
that's the real panic here. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced the lockdown is unnecessary. We're destroying. Our economy is collapsing, not from the virus. I love when I read, the virus has caused it. No, the virus didn't cause it. People aren't unemployed because they're too sick to go to work. They're unemployed because they've been told to stay home. They can't go to work. The panic is what's causing this.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And the other thing, you brought up Taiwan. The one country that's been excluded from this discussion by the WHO and the Chinese and most of the other countries is Taiwan. They had something like 6 deaths from coronavirus and several hundred cases. And yet they were forcibly excluded from any discussions, any attendance at meetings by the WHO, while the WHO was carrying the water for the Chinese and continuing.
Because they're not in the UN. Yeah, because they won't let them in the UN because China says they're not a country.
Right, but even if they're not in the UN, they should be part of the discussion within the WHO. They certainly should be on this, and even on this, they're not being listened to or not being allowed to speak.
Yeah. I was astounded when I heard those numbers. I made a number of inquiries. I have lists of the things that they did. Exactly what their program. Their prevention program looked like, because that's the kind of program that we need next time. This ain't the last virus.
Well, and Taiwan, when they heard about COVID-19 on the mainland, they completely shut down travel from mainland China way back in, I believe it was back in December or early January. And that's the reason that they have remained healthy and haven't had this COVID-19 problem.
Well, that's one of the reasons, but they're very aggressive about testing and isolating people who test positive, and also keeping people who are susceptible away from people who test positive.
Mm-hmm. Well,
they have a very detailed program that would be worth copying.
Well, common sense has got to be part of any discussion here. And of course, when we're talking Agenda 21, we're talking pandemic, or some people refer to it as plandemic, and some of these other crazy things that are going on. There's a total lack of common sense, and common sense has got to be the only way we approach anything. And that's why you gentlemen are on. Because,
but that means don't panic. Panic is defined as a lack of common sense.
Exactly.
Right? So what we got to do is make sure that we stop panicking about these things. No, I heard that Canada had a 500-page pandemic plan that they developed 10 years ago or something. They never implemented it. No, it's another one. It's shelf job, as we call it in my business, right? A bunch of people wrote a big report. Somebody put it on a shelf. Okay, we could have, if we had been prepared to mobilize properly from the beginning, we wouldn't be where we are today. A complete lack of planning for this.
Well, and
the federal level and the state level.
Federal and state levels, yeah. I hope that's one thing that will come out of this mess, is that we'll actually start to. I mean, this isn't the first virus. God, we had SARS. The list is long, and but no preparation. There was no preparation.
And they attack people who come up with things that seem to be working, like hydroxychloroquine,
You can say that word. Could you say that word again? Because I only read it. Because I've wondered what it sounded like.
Yeah, well, that's what it's supposed to sound like. It's hydroxychloroquine, but
yeah, right.
It's quinine derivative that is something that they've used for different, things like
malaria,
dengue fever, malaria, things that are a bit of a problem in Africa and other parts of the world. But the fact is that the research shows that it works quite well against COVID-19.
In if it's early diagnosis, or if you're already taking it, right? So all those malaria people are safe. There's another major confusion there with these treatments. With the HQ versus with zinc, by the way, I think you're supposed to take it. But anyway, another one of those confusions where all of a sudden everybody's got an opinion and they're all different.
A lot of times that they've used hydroxychloroquine have been in cases of advanced COVID problems, and this is all anecdotal at this point. Mostly anyway, but in a number of those cases, people that thought they were going to die within 24 hours were miraculously cured by the Z-Pack in combination with the hydroxychloroquine. And then in the midst of all that, you've got another cadre of people, back to your comments earlier, Dan and Dave, that don't want to see hydroxychloroquine used, or some of these others. I'm trying to remember the remdesivir.
Yeah, I was going to say it's like rheumatism.
They want to see some long-term studies done first, and that is insane, because if you have people who are going to die, you need to give the drugs that you have right now and hope that they work. If you don't give them anything, they could be dead by tomorrow. And it's the same with a lot of other drugs that maybe will have an applicability here. And
this, by the way, this points to another problem, which is the whole FDA apparatus for approvals and things like that is not designed. In fact, they said that at one point. We're not designed to move fast. Right? They're used to taking years and years to clinical trials and double blinds and peer review and all that sort of thing. Well, we don't have years, So there should be a mechanism for saying, okay, this is an emergency, shift into emergency gear, right? In which case you throw the drugs out at people, and there's your clinical trials as you see if it helps.
Well, I'm going to throw another fly in the ointment here. I want to hear your comments. But one of the things with hydroxychloroquine is that it's very inexpensive. It's a very simple drug to manufacture. It's very inexpensive, and it looks to me like Big Pharma's got big plans for the future of COVID-19, because look at the money that's being spent now. Yeah. Sure.
They like slow. Okay. I mean, big companies like regulation because they keep people from growing. They keep small companies from becoming big companies. Mm-hmm. This is a standard problem with high regulatory bars, is that only the big companies can afford to cross them, and they keep innovation and small companies out of the business.
But by the same token, what you're seeing right now, and thank goodness the government is not stepping in and trying to stop this, there are some consortia of drug companies that are teaming up and sharing their data, sharing their results together as a single team to try to develop vaccines and drugs that will work here. That's never been done before. And in the past, it's not been allowed, where the various drug companies and other...
that would be antitrust, right?
Right.
Yeah. No, that is good. Another thing that's good is that the way all the scientific publishers are pooling their stuff. They're putting everything that's related to this problem out free, no subscription. They're building search engines and collections simply to support the researchers. That's been exciting.
They're bringing the supercomputers into this process.
Yeah. Instead of running climate models about what's going to happen in 2070, yeah.
Yeah, we can come back to that climate model stuff. Right now, the focus is how do we speed up the process of developing a vaccine? And we've never seen anything like what we're witnessing today by unleashing the forces of free enterprise entrepreneurship here in the United States. It's amazing what can be done by allowing people that have never made a face mask before or a ventilator before, you get them going or you get them back in the business. One of the things de Blasio did in New York was got rid of the ventilators and masks and other things, the other equipment that they had in stock. They had a lot of it there, but he said, well, it's taking up a lot of space. We need that space. It takes maintenance. It takes hours of staff time to keep this going. So they put it on the market and sold it off at auction. And then all of a sudden they needed it again. Another place had thousands of masks, but they had them around for 10 years. And by the time they needed them, the elastic was no longer functional. It was brittle and the masks were worthless. So there's got to be a factoring in of how do you do this? How do you keep a certain stock available? How do you keep right incentive?
That would be a prevention and a plan. That would be obviously part of a plan.
But
just like a military exercise, you have to have stockpiles, which you keep up. Okay, that's the problem with stockpiles, of course, is they're expensive. But that's much better than destroying your economy.
Right. And
which again, it's too late to do that now. But we can do it for the next time.
Yeah, and there've got to be incentives as well for the assembly lines to have an ability to jump back into making ventilators or making masks or some other things, because if they're getting no tax benefits or other benefits for maintaining an assembly line that they needed 10 years ago but haven't needed since then, it's hard to tell a company you need to retain this for who knows how many years where it won't be used. So all of these factors need to be dealt with in this forward-thinking process for how we deal with the next pandemic.
Yeah, I would like to talk about the economic impacts of what's been happening and just exactly how we need to turn this whole program around, where we get people back to work and we start thinking about better ways, using a little bit of common sense, better ways to isolate, as you say, like they've done in Taiwan, where when people have evidence of having COVID-19, we have a way of isolating them and then treating them and not trying to destroy our whole society.
Yeah. And here in Northern Virginia, where I live, we're being told the corona cases and deaths are continuing to climb, not very fast, just a little bit here and a little bit there. But we're being told until there is no more of that, we're not going to be allowed to go open up our barber shop or whatever, a restaurant. And that makes no sense either. I still have not seen anything as to where these cases are happening, where the deaths are happening. Are they all among a certain population group in a certain nursing home or in some other places? Is it a carefully, is it a small area or a one facility that's driving these numbers up? Those are important things to know.
No, there's an interesting point. The CDC is working on some new guidance, and a lot of people are pretty upset about it. But one thing they do is they, in terms of getting out of lockdown, is they apparently have, and I've only seen a little bit on this, but they apparently have different degrees of risk, like small, medium, and large. Okay, and this is depending on, like, if you got a community that's a hot spot. With a lot of cases, you treat that differently than what you do with a community that doesn't have anything or has got. I was in happened to see my barber the other day. That's another story, although it's a story that is worth telling. I mean, let me tell that real quick and then move on. In our county, or that's actually Frederick County, Maryland, Virginia, over in Northern Virginia. If he had cut any hair, it'd be a $500 fine, and if he cut it in his shop, they were going to jerk his license. Now that's really draconian. Mm-hmm. Okay, but the thing is, I went to get meat, and the way that the butcher was working is they only let 3 people in the shop, so it was this long line outside on the sidewalk, and we're all standing there, and of course we're talking. It turned out that in that county there was exactly one case. Not one death, one case. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's not New York City, right? And yeah, as I said, we're gonna be feeling our way out of this. I've actually got 2 pieces of hopefulness. I won't call it optimism, but I call them hopefulness. The one is that there's going to be competition among the states as they start pulling out of this thing. I heard the other day that Rhode Island's actually going to pull out of the lockdown pretty fast, even though they have a higher death rate that's something like 3 times higher than Oregon, which sounds like it's never going to come out.
Mm-hmm. Well, the sad part about this whole thing is that does this remind you of the Soviet Union or living under communism, where you have long lines to get meat or anything else? I mean, this is the stupidest thing. We are killing free enterprise in the United States.
Oh, yeah.
We're killing our personal freedoms. It's not just that. It's this network of spies and tattletales and ratting out your neighbors and your family members. It's spies with cameras, all this sort of thing to keep an eye on anybody who doesn't keep 6 feet distance or doesn't wear a mask in a certain place or goes out to a park when the park is supposedly closed, or a beach. Or I'm trying to remember if this was Michigan. If you go out on the lake in your canoe or your rowboat, you're okay. But if you stick a motor on it and go out, you're not.
Yeah, more nonsense. Well, I just want to, the point I was trying to make, maybe I didn't get across, is that people do not want to be locked down, okay? And as things start to loosen up, I have a feeling that they're going to loosen up fairly fast because of competition, because, you don't want the state next door to be doing better, or better yet, because people are going to look at it and they're going to get mad. People in states with long lockdowns, like I said, are going to revolt. That's certainly a possibility.
California is because it sounds to me like Newsom is talking about California locking down for a very long time. If there is a perfect example of why we have states in the first place, the idea of the state is each state can set their own regulation, and they will attract people. Texas is an example of all the people escaping from California are heading to Texas or Arizona because they don't have so many of these draconian laws.
Yeah, but it's also that puts pressure on backing off of those laws. The other thing that I'm hopeful about is you saw the stock market recover quickly. Is that we may be able to recover fairly quickly. My reasoning is this. This is not a natural recession or a depression. When we get depressions and big recessions, they're natural objects. We don't know why they happen, as a matter of fact. They come on, they stay around for a long time, and they go away. That's not what's happening here. Okay, we did this to ourselves. I like to think we might be able to undo it pretty quickly. That is that people go back to work, they start paying their taxes, they're good. So, it's entirely possible that we're not looking at a massive long-term recession. Now, I'm not saying I'm optimistic, I'm just hopeful, because it does fit the data to some extent.
Yeah, and that gets you back to this whole thing that we talked about early on, which is the tie-in with these groups and these Ocasio-Cortez types and Pelosi and so forth, who want to have a Green New Deal moving forward out of this, who see the pandemic over COVID, the panic-demic, maybe you call it, as a dress rehearsal, a blueprint for a long-term, permanent, climate-based, renewable energy, ban fossil fuels future. And if any of that gets traction, where they're doing carbon credits and carbon taxes and so forth, take us decades to come out of this kind of a corona crisis. If Trump is replaced by a Pelosi by consortium with Ocasio-Cortez, we're going to be years and years from coming out of this, if we ever can, for a lot of different reasons, not just tied to energy, but their whole Green New Deal format is anti-American worker on so many levels. So hopefully what you're saying is very possible. I'm as well hopeful, but a lot of that's going to depend on who our leadership is and how we take this broader look at the death tolls, the problems, the risk factors, where the deaths are actually occurring and where they're not, and whether the entire county or state or city needs to be shut down over something that's happening in a very discrete area to a very discrete population.
Which is kind of quarantine on a macroscopic level. Okay, where, you know, when you, almost like fighting fires, when you get the big fire out, you go around fighting the small fires. Okay, so we can focus our resources on the places where there's a real problem and let the rest of the economy, society loosen up. That might be a viable strategy. No, and it may work. It may work because I believe there's going to be tremendous political pressure to open up. Because, you know, all these unemployed people vote.
Mm-hmm. Well,
why should the 67% be told they can't work and earn an income, pay their mortgage, buy food, and the other things that you need to have a job to do, by the 37% that are in the ruling elite and media classes who are not affected except on a very minimal way by this lockdown?
Mm-hmm.
So this might actually be an opportunity for the Republicans because they tend to be on the open side. Democrats, as you say, are on the closed side, keep everything shut down. So this might actually work out for the elections in November.
Yep.
Unless somebody, well, all right, that's a possibility anyway.
Well, I think at this point, too, the president has got to be listening to people like you gentlemen and to programs like this that talk about these issues, because the reality is that he's been listening to Fauci and to some of the people who I see as a bigger part of the problem than they are any part of the solution.
But
well, there is a. I know he's gonna at least hear from me, because there's a letter that I'm one of the signers of that's going to be hand delivered to him by a member of Congress next week.
Good.
And it says a lot of this stuff.
But even Fauci and Birx are beginning to recognize the health and death and other tolls that from the lockdowns themselves. We're not hearing a lot, but every once in a while they give it at least some attention.
Well, Paul, you and I need to do a little research in this area and get some numbers out there, perhaps. Get flesh these bones out and get them out where our friends in the press can run with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I love doing
this show.
If you have any friends in the press,
well, actually, Paul and I are in the press in the sense that I write an op-ed every week. Yeah, and he does too. So, you know, I mean, we're in that sense, we are the press.
You are the press, yeah. Well, it's like we're media right here.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, media. Okay. By the way, Dan, I have to jump in and say, the last time I did this show with you guys, I came away with a bunch of ideas and the whole idea about planning that we need to do, and now I've just done it again. I love coming here because you guys have got me thinking.
Well, I've had friends who are listeners refer to our program as a PhD course in how the world really works. So you gentlemen are part of that faculty. So thank you for being here.
Well, here's a question. You were throwing in. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Paul.
No, I was just saying it's my pleasure and my honor to be part of this discussion.
Yeah. Here's a question that occurred to me a few minutes ago. In fact, we were talking. Is there no agency in the federal government who has the mission to look at the economic side of this stuff and to look at the adverse health impacts of these lockdowns, the stuff that Paul has been talking about? Uh-huh. Surely there's some Council of Economic Advisors. I don't know. There's got to be some agency in the federal government because they do everything, right? who should be doing this kind of research that we're talking about.
Exactly. And I'm not aware of any, but I think this new economic team, this Get Back to Work team that the president has put together.
Maybe that'll be the core, the catalyst.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we definitely need to be talking to the president because I think he's had some very, very bad advice during this COVID-19 scare. And you're right, it's a panic. And we need to use a lot more common sense. And if there's ever been a president who seems to like to use common sense, this is the one.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're pulled along, driven along by the media and by all the noise coming from certain factions. But as things move along a little bit further, you have a chance to think a little bit. That part of what the president's been doing and the governors have been doing and so forth has been to buy ourselves a little time. So we've had that time now, and hopefully we're going to get out of the panic mode and start looking at these broader pictures and get us back to work, focus on the isolated places where the problems still exist, find a way to deal with those problems in a way that protects the rest of society and quarantines the small parts that are sick rather than quarantining the entire society, which has, as we keep saying, so many health and economic and familial and other problems, alcoholism, drugs, family violence is going up. You're hearing more and more about crisis centers and getting these calls about domestic abuse cases going through the roof. So those are all parts of this, and hopefully someone from the White House economic team and other folks are actually listening in, or maybe they're having the same conversations we are. And this will move forward out of the mess we're in. Get us back to work, get us back to functioning as a society. And I think we're going to take out of this a lot of good lessons for future flu seasons and so forth, how to better avoid spreading these things. Maybe Corona is worse than that, but I don't know. I haven't seen enough of the real specific data as to who's getting sick, who's dying, who's really getting severely sick from this, because those numbers are not coming out so far. So, again, moving forward, we'll learn a lot more about how to deal with the next pandemic and the one after that, because as David has said, this is not the first time. There was a flu season in 1957, 2 years after the last big polio epidemic, when I got polio in 1955. But in 1957, 116,000 Americans died from the flu within just a couple of months. Mm-hmm. And nothing was shut down back then. I know there's a different attitude about precautionary principle and deaths and so forth. But we also had people who...
Well, there weren't any computer models.
There you go.
Seriously, this is where the panic is coming from. People can generate these absurd numbers, and they're taken as the fact. The article article came out of mine today. I'm attacking USA Today for spreading panic, because they took this wacko study that said that, 3 billion people are where they live now is going to be uninhabitable. And instead of saying, hey, look at what this study said, this is kind of weird, they're saying this is a warning. They're saying this is true. Okay. Well, we didn't have that in 1954 or 1957. It's really a serious problem.
We also had in 1957 something called common sense. And we've certainly seen a lack of that in this whole pandemic thing. I want to get back to the discussion, though, Paul and David, about the climate change nonsense and how they're using this COVID-19 thing, as Rahm Emanuel says, never let a good crisis go to waste. Let's talk about how they are actually now manipulating all this to try to make part of it.
Well, the one part, I mean, like AOC, what Sunrise and AOC and people like that are all saying, hey, is we proposed this massive program, and you said we can't do something that big. They said it should be as big as World War II mobilization, and one of the standard arguments was, you got to be kidding, we can't do that. And now they say, look, you can do it, you just did it.
Yeah, and the is this what we want to do? Is this really what we want to do moving forward? Do we want to have a perpetual lockdown with?
No, that's not what they're calling for. But you see their point. Okay, we actually disrupted our society for what we thought was a good reason. Now we think maybe not. But their point is, well, we want to disrupt society for a good reason too. So the whole argument, the whole economic argument, and against the Green New Deal has been drastically weakened because we've demonstrated that we can do things that crazy.
But we've also demonstrated how disastrous doing.
No, that as you keep saying, though, that news ain't out there.
Yeah, well, that's our job.
There's nothing. If you can find an article in the New York Times about how this has been economically disastrous, I'll consider eating it.
Or if you even more of an article would be how this has been disastrous for American health care.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, all of that. But I have one, by the way, when I write, my word for what's happened is collapse. Mm-hmm. And I thought it out, economic collapse. We have actually precipitated, and it's a good word. Mm-hmm. It exists for a reason, and it has collapsed. Now we have to rebuild it. But anyway, that's one way, Dan, to get back to your point, that is one of the arguments they're using, and it's in its way a strong argument. Okay? We said, no, we can't do anything that drastic. Well, we've just demonstrated that we can do something that drastic.
Well, and that's why they keep referring to this as maybe being the new normal, how, this lockdown of society, that we might consider this being the new normal. I can't imagine anything more abnormal than what we've done.
Yeah, well, that doesn't flow from the Green New Deal, but what flows from it is they're talking about, let's rebuild. We have to rebuild society, so let's rebuild it what they consider to be properly. Okay, and that's like nobody flies for recreation anymore. Okay, and then we got to turn anyway, you know what the Green New Deal did.
Yeah, and a matter of fact, I did hear
that question on this. It seems.
Okay, go ahead, Paul. I want to get Paul. I want to get in to the discussion because you wrote an excellent book called Eco-Imperialism, and how so many of these programs that the radical environmentalists want to promote are things that are counterproductive for society and for the poorest of society. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and that gets to this whole attitude that a ruling elite has a right, an obligation, because they're smarter or more concerned about the planet, for example, than the rest of us. They have some sort of a right or an obligation to tell the rest of the world how the rest of us have to live now. Al Gore can go flying off in private jets and take private limos all over the planet to talk to the rest of us about how we need to live and how we need to save the planet from what's going on in computer models. But the rest of us have to shut down our lives to a larger extent. We need to cut back our living standards. The people in Africa and India and other places are going to be allowed to have only as much energy as they can get from a few wind turbines and solar panels, and that they can improve their living standards and so their lifestyles, but only a little bit at and to me, that is ultimately
the UN Agenda 21 and everything has always talked about overconsumption. Yeah. Overconsumption, overproduction. Yeah, but that's the imperialism.
It's based again on these models that assume all this climate change today is man-made. It's all due from carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions, that the climate changes, whatever the models spit out, garbage in, garbage out, has to be treated as our future unless we act very desperately and determinedly to prevent this terrible future of ecological climate devastation, when in reality, nothing the computer models have ever predicted has come true. David, you mentioned tornadoes and hurricanes a little while ago, but if you look at the reality, not what's in the computer models or the headlines or the New York Times and so forth, but the reality, graph, and it was actually in the Washington Post last year. The end of the year, it pointed out that in 2018, for the first time in history, we did not have one single violent tornado touchdown anywhere in the United States. And the high point chart, this bar graph, aside from that, which was phenomenally interesting to me, was that if you look at the violent tornado record from 1955 to from 1950 to 1985, there were about twice violent tornadoes in that 35-year period than there were in the next 35-year period up through 2018. So everything that the climate alarmists were saying was just the opposite of what was happening out there in the real world, as documented by actual measurements and evidence of tornadoes. Same thing with hurricanes. You don't see actual hurricanes getting worse or more frequent. And in fact, from Hurricane Wilma in 2005 until Harvey in 2017, we did not have any Category 3 to 5 hurricanes hit the United States. Completely the opposite of what the alarmists were claiming was going to happen. So to base, again, our policies on computer models that are just complete garbage in and garbage out is the most insane thing we can do. So here again, we need a red team, blue team approach to this. We need people that are going to look at how valid the science is behind some of these scares, whether it's a pandemic or it's climate change, and then look at what the effects would be of shifting to all quote, quote, sustainable, renewable wind, solar, biofuel, battery future and getting rid of fossil fuels and nuclear. It would be an ecological disaster as well as a human disaster for the whole planet.
Well, one of the things that happens when we look at all these claims and all these scares and all these panics is somehow they always end up giving the communist countries a free pass. China, the most polluted environment in the world, is the darling of the UN. And they're the darling of all this climate change nonsense, even though they're the biggest polluters in the world. Why is it that every time there's a communist country, they get a free pass?
And it's the same on COVID. They're getting a free pass on that in a lot of the media circles They're not getting the blame that they should. It goes partly to the university and school system we have, the media people that do the talking, the intolerance of the left that won't give an even break to free enterprise capitalism here in the United States or to our system of government, but look at the aspiration or the claims of the communist side and accept the aspirations and the claims as reality.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, Thumper says there's a couple of Q posts that we need to be taking a look at. Thumper, do you have those posts that we need to put up?
What's a Q post?
Sorry about that. You're not familiar with Q?
No.
Well, these Q posts.
I prefer the term technologically senile, but my wife has harsher language for this because she's my IT department. You know, she has 4 iPads. Anyway. So no, I don't know. I don't know from nothing.
Okay, well, Q is an operation that we believe started from a group of people who are in support of President Trump, and it started October 26th of 2017, and since that time, we are now up to 4,201 individual posts. And the posts that I'm going to put up on the screen right now, I don't know, are you able to see the screen there, David?
No.
Oh, okay.
How long is it?
They range in size.
Okay.
The different posts that we have that have come in since the show started. We have Q post 4199 came in, and it says for anons, and basically it means the anonymous folks out there who have been following the Q posts and decoding them as they go along. And then the next Q post that came in at 1339 this afternoon, just a little after the show started, and it starts out with Technofog. It is a repost of a Twitter post that somebody put up there, and they thought it was important. It says the initial Flynn/Kislyak leak was not to David Ignatius, it was to Washington Post reporter Adam Entos. The leak came directly from sources who saw a transcript and described it to Entos. Quote. Okay. And then there's from Technofag Twat, a Twitter post from this Technofag, and it takes us to a Twitter post. And I'll bring that up and put it on the screen for everyone. And it is the Twitter post for this Technofog. And just gives a basis for the why they're picking this, and it basically, you know, it tells everybody Q is confirming for us that this Flynn-Kislyak leak was not to David Ignatius, but it was to the Washington Post reporter Adam Entos. All right, and then we go back to the Q post here. And it says developing the initial Flynn, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on and gives us some interesting facts from a decode, basically, from what somebody has done. And it has a picture of President Obama. And I believe that, let's see, is that Uma Abedin or is that
Susan Rice?
Susan Rice. Susan Rice. Yeah, that's Susan Rice. And let me resize that so it looks a little, everybody can see it on the screen here. And meeting Obama Biden Oval Office meeting on January 5th was key to entire anti-Trump operation. And then on February 9th, strategy to get Flynn fired didn't immediately work. So another leak was developed to Greg Miller, Adam Entos, and Ellen Nakashima of the Washington Post. That article headline, National Security Advisor Flynn discussed sanctions with Russian ambassador despite denials, officials say. And they show Adam Entos, the Washington Post, and then there's a series of communications here, and it says it really has Huck didn't AEWP, and that stands for Adam Entos, Washington Post.
Adam Entos, Washington Post.
When we gave it to him, gave him that tape. Okay. And so it just it's showing the links and the proofs of how they set up Admiral Flynn or General Flynn. Sorry, I'm former Navy. Set up General Flynn in this major operation, which is being unraveled now that General Flynn has been exonerated from the accusations that he, lied to him and all this other stuff. And then the final Q post that just came in, 4201, it says it's one of the things Q has been doing is these are like movie posters for movies that are coming up, and it says at the top here, they never thought she would lose. Q. Okay, they never thought Hillary would lose, and they'd be dealing with President Trump. And the main theme of this poster is panic in D.C. in theaters now. And then Q has posted down below that, says, enjoy the show. And Q has told us all to invest in popcorn stocks, get lots of popcorn, sit back and enjoy the show, because it's been very interesting the last couple of weeks with a lot of the declassification, the exoneration of General Flynn, and there's more to come because they are going to start bringing these people down piece by piece by putting out what really did happen and who's responsible for it and just how high up in the organization all of this was made possible. And it goes all the way right up to the 44th resident of the White House. Yeah, we don't really like to refer to him as president because his code name, his Secret Service code name was Renegade, and this has been pointed out to us several times by Q. And when you go and look at the definition for renegade is a traitor, a deserter. It has numerous, none of them good. Mm-hmm. And when he was able to choose his Secret Service code, because they get to choose theirs, that's the code name that number 44 chose for himself when the Secret Service asked him to pick his secret call, or his call sign or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I want to mention to David too that poster's got a great big red panic in DC, so that's very appropriate that you mentioned your panics in pandemic, COVID-19, as well as the environmental thing. And now the panic is that they're being exposed for exactly the kind of treason and the things that they've done. Incidentally, Thumper, you know that Hillary Clinton, when she was First Lady, when she flew on Air Force One, they referred to that as the Broom One.
Yeah, Broom One.
Broom One. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Her code name was Evergreen. Her Secret Service code was Evergreen.
Ah, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. And let's see. I'm trying to remember what President Clinton's was. No, I can't think of it right now.
Yeah,
Chat will tell me.
We'll hear for sure.
Yeah. Chat will tell us.
Let's get back to the discussion, because I do want to give Paul an opportunity to get back into this discussion because of the books that you've written about radical green. I know you did a book, not only your eco-imperialism, but you also co-wrote a book with Ron. Trying to think of Ron's last name. You tell me. Paul, you're going to need to unmute. Anyway, there are a lot of connections between radical green and a lot of the things that have been happening in the COVID-19 thing. I mean, there's a lot of parallels there, and that's what I want to. We've got a little less than a half an hour. I want to point out as many things as we can that those parallels lead to, and then maybe talk about what we can do to make. Let's make this crisis go in reverse. Let's get things accomplished that are the exact opposite of what the radical left want to do.
Yeah, big part of the problem with the radical left is once they figured out how to tap into our tax code and our government funding and foundation money, a lot of systems that were set up long before there was a radical environmental movement with the pressure groups bringing to bear all sorts of nastiness and lawsuits and so forth against not just American corporations, but against people's access to energy and modern agriculture and so forth over in the most impoverished, powerless countries on the planet. We set up a system that let people build these tax-exempt organizations and foundations that made a lot of sense when it was the Red Cross, for example.
Yeah.
Now the left has taken control of so much of that money, money that was often made in free enterprise, mining, forestry, agriculture, technology, oil and gas, and taken that money, and all of a sudden the new generation is guilt-ridden that they are the beneficiaries, the inheritors of all this money that came from exploiting the planet, and they've got a tax code that lets them create foundations and give out this money to radical environmental groups who are pushing agroecology or wind, solar, biofuels, pseudo-renewable energy. And we don't have a system at this point that can really challenge them. There are, just in the United States, the environmentalist movement, all these various organizations like the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, they're about a $10 billion a year operation. They don't do anything productive like manufacture anything. They're all pressure group politics, getting into the educational system, getting out all kinds of misinformation, disinformation about, or just ignorant information about wind and solar and fossil fuels and nuclear and all these various things about the modern agriculture versus organic that's supposed to be so much better for the planet, when in reality even organic uses all kinds of very nasty chemicals that are dangerous to the planet as well as to the humans who use them. And they're able to get away with a lot of this because of the power base they have built and the monetary base they've built. On our end of the political spectrum, we don't have anything quite ready to take that on. They're 90 to 100% of all their money goes into this pressure group, public education, miseducation. On the other end of the spectrum, the big oil and big coal and big mining and big forestry, big agriculture that they talk about, they probably don't even put 1% of their money into education and re-educating people about free enterprise. So even though they get the the public is told that the evil people, the moneyed people, are the ones in free enterprise capitalism, where the money really is for pressure group and policy making is on the left end of the political spectrum. So that, in a nutshell, is why we're where we are right now. And the media's been on their side, so they get all that free press that drives the same viewpoints that they are espousing. We don't have, aside from what you guys are doing, Thumper and Dan, we don't have a lot of the same capabilities, but we need to build them. And Donald Trump's victory a couple of years back indicates that there's an awful lot of people who haven't bought into this far left political concept. And they're pretty angry about where this country has been driven by the ruling elites, the media elites, the university elites. So I see there's some hope there, but we better recognize what we're up against.
Well, there's a lot of money, federal money, flowing into that system. As you know, Paul, you and I looked at USAID, and they do about a third or about half, I guess, of the U.S. Foreign aid money, and a lot of that foreign aid money is flowing right into those organizations, those green organizations. And because state's still on the left. A lot of the stuff that has happened, Trump's never been able to touch it. It's too far down, too much embedded. For the president alone just to do anything about it.
Well, plus, David, let me just interject. One of the things that the left has been doing with the media and Congress, the Democrats, have been to prevent President Trump from getting confirmed the people that he wants in there. And that is a very carefully driven agenda of keeping his people out of the government so that he couldn't do any of that, on top of all the impeachment stuff that he had to deal with and that the public has had to deal with. So that adds to what you're saying. Absolutely.
Paul, Paul, I want you to talk a little bit. Ron Arnold and you wrote a book called The Big Green Money Machine. Now, you have a lot of experience in how these foundations work and how much money is there. And you're speaking as someone who's actually written a book with someone on that. This isn't hypothesis. This is fact, isn't it, about the money?
Oh, absolutely. And what David is saying, and I want David to weigh in on this a little bit more, because he's really familiar with what a lot of the government agencies are doing. They give money directly and indirectly to all these organizations, as well as the foundations, the individual contributions to some place like Sierra Club or Greenpeace are very small fry in the overall monetary picture for these multi-million, multi-billion dollar organizations who have at the very least tens or if not hundreds of millions of dollars in their coffers at any given time. But they're getting an awful lot of money directly from the federal government, either as grants or as thanks for having brought lawsuits that were orchestrated between the courts and the federal government agencies and these pressure groups that really went big time during the Obama years. But it's been a problem and continues to be a problem right now and for the years preceding Obama, where an organization like Sierra Club could bring a lawsuit that was carefully orchestrated in cahoots with a federal agency like Department of the Interior's Fish and Wildlife Service, and they before a friendly court. They get exactly the decision that they wanted, and then they get $1 million in attorney's fees and court costs for having brought the collusive lawsuit.
Right.
So those are just the things that
it's a neat trick because you avoid Congress and you avoid the laws and regulations. Well, you got a law, but then in agency, what really happens? The agencies want to have want to have these rules. They can't pass them, so they work one of these lawsuits, and the court tells them, okay, this is going to be the rule. And yes, and they then fund the people who are suing them. I know EPA is trying to stop that. I'm not sure where that's gotten, but I'm sure it's true in other agencies as well. In fact, while we've been talking, I actually thought of the two agencies that should be looking into the adverse economic effects and of the lockdowns, and they're the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor. I mean, these are right. Commerce should be looking at the impact on business, and labor should be looking at the impact on workers. I doubt either one is doing that.
Well, then the National Institutes of Health should be looking at the health.
Right. So, of course, we don't have an institute of suicide. Maybe we should. But,
yeah. Well, back to your point a second ago, David, before I forget, one other aspect of these collusive lawsuits that gets forgotten is the people that are going to get affected by the decision being made by this collusive arrangement between the court, the federal agency, the environmentalist pressure group. The people who are going to be affected by the new rule that comes out of that collusion never get to have a day in court.
Well, there's no notice and comment. First of all, they don't have standing to join in the lawsuit, and this is the way the agency avoids going through notice and comment. There's standard regulatory procedure wherein people could make those statements. Okay, that's why they like it. It avoids all the controls that we built up over the years on overregulation. Okay, they don't go through the regulatory process. They go through a judicial process, which they encourage and ultimately pay for.
Right.
So we pay for it.
So what the Trump guys, EPA and so forth, are saying, we're not going to allow any more of these collusive lawsuits, at least during our reign. As soon as it's gone, if somebody new Obama administration comes in, they'll do it all over again. And my feeling was we should have had, before we stopped collusive lawsuits, we should have had a bunch of collusive lawsuits of our own on the right end of the political spectrum and do the same thing that the lefties were doing all those years, and then we put a stop to collusive lawsuits.
Well, one of the things that comes out of all this, too, guys, is the fact that the agencies and these environmental groups, it's literally a revolving door between. Right. The jobs, they go back and forth. Somebody will be part of some environmental group, and next thing you know, they're the head of an agency or a second or third in command of an agency, and that happens all the time.
Yeah, it's at the administrator, the assistant administrator, or the deputy, or the assistant secretaries, or the deputy to the assistant secretaries. That's where the action is. And yes, it is a revolving door. I do have to say one thing. It's a different topic, although it's about the lawsuits. Another one of the solutions I'm playing with, and this is not with the government, but with the press. My article today which has USA Today pushes climate panic, and there's we know my last sentence or next to last sentence. So maybe all we need is for frightened children to start suing the evergreen press for scaring them. We know that the children are scared. We now have data on it. The Brits did a study, and they had something like 17% of the kids are having nightmares about climate change. Well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. So, the other side, the left, has had their children lawsuits under climate change, right? I mean, the courts threw them out because they were asking the court to start running the government. And making policy and stuff. But on the other hand, if we got all these scared children, I see no reason why some of them couldn't get together and sue the press for scaring them.
I think the operative term, the legal term, is intentional infliction of emotional distress.
Right.
So
well, these articles certainly look like that to me. By the way, although if you can't prove intent, then how about negligence?
Yeah.
Okay, the negligent because they don't look at the other side, right? They have neglected the counter arguments. They've neglected the counter argument.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you might not win these suits, but I think if a handful of kids who were scared and are now over it, like that wonderful woman that Hartland found, the German, you know, if they were to sue, say, USA Today, saying on an article like this, saying, you know, you have hurt us, or you. By the way, another possibility is just asking for injunctive relief. Okay, not damages, although damages would be fun because that'll get the press's attorneys in. But, you know, a court order saying, I believe they had in England, they actually got a court order saying that inconvenient truths could not be shown in the schools unless it was explained what the other side had to say. Okay, that it was propaganda. Well, you know, there isn't any reason you couldn't go into court and ask for an injunction telling the news they have to do both sides. They can't just say, look, the world is going to go to hell. We're all going to be extinct, without saying, well, but other people say it ain't so. And credible people. Anyway, I just wanted to get that on because that was kind of the hallmark of the thing that I just wrote today. Is I'm now looking into children's lawsuits.
Well, I can tell you one thing is the fact that they tried to make CO2 into a dangerous gas when, in fact, we couldn't survive without CO2. And frankly, we could use a lot more of it. We
could use more because of the greening. Yeah, it's plant food, and it's our food because plants are our food. Yes, it is. As I like to put it, atmospheric CO2 is the world's food supply. Period.
Well, I can't begin to count the number of times. I can't begin to count the number of times when the people in the media were confusing carbon dioxide with carbon monoxide.
Right. Well,
byproducts of fires and saying how dangerous carbon monoxide was. And yeah, it is, but it's not the same as what we exhale and what plants inhale to grow and grow more quickly and with less water. The more CO2 in the atmosphere, the better they grow, the less water they require, the less water they transpire, the better they survive droughts.
Because the holes that they open so that the CO2 will wander in and they can eat it don't have to be as big. If you think of it from a machine point of view, you're sitting there, you've got a passive receptor sitting there, and the problem is that the holes that take in that they hope the CO2 will wander into, so where they can eat it, also let water out. So that's why the drought resistance increases with higher levels of CO2. But none of this. Anyway.
Well,
I tell you what I'm going to do tomorrow. I'm going to look at the organization charts of the Department of Labor and the Department of Commerce and see if I can find the agencies, the offices within those two that ought to be looking at this stuff that we're talking about, at the catastrophic economic and social and personal effects of the lockdowns.
Well, David, I'd
look at NIH. Be sure you look at NIH and a couple of the other health organizations within the government.
And David, I'd throw Treasury into that mix as well.
Treasury should be looking. Look at the tax revenue. What this is going to do, and I mean
and the levels of debt that we're leaving our children and our grandchildren.
Yeah. That's right. Anyway, yes, those. I have to think that maybe those studies are going to start being done. Now we just have to get the press interested in them.
Yeah. The other wrinkle in all of this is how many children are we each going to have? In Italy, it's 0.9 children per person. So they're on a downward trajectory. Yeah. Japan is in the same situation. China's in the same situation now. Right. Who will support all these retired folks that are collecting Social Security and welfare or Medicare, Medicaid, and that sort of thing? Who supports them if you've got fewer and fewer working age people?
Well, we need a pandemic, Paul. We need a pandemic. We need COVID-19 because it gets rid of those useless eaters.
I don't recall if it was Paul Ehrlich or John Holdren, but one of those types of folks was saying a few years back that the problem in the world right now is we've got all these things that keep alive longer, so you don't have all the childhood death and all the other things killing people off, and they're living longer, and what we need is something to kill them off, prevent them from getting as old as they are.
Part of that was Obamacare, and of course the death panels and things like that, because after all, is that, and I can't think of the guy's name, but he was the head of that whole program, talked about how after people are 75, they shouldn't get health care because after 75, they deserve to die. I'm telling you, we've got so many lunatics running the asylum. That's why we need to get back to the conversations like we've had today.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the programs you guys would like to see come into play. We've got about 5 minutes left, a little over. The programs you would like to see come into play that would bring common sense back to government.
Number one on my list, at least in the climate arena, is a red team, blue team analysis of all the claims about carbon dioxide being dangerous to human health and welfare, the endangerment decision by the EPA. It's all based on a very narrow-minded analysis of the costs and benefits of fossil fuels, the effects of carbon dioxide based on the assumption that carbon dioxide was causing all this climate change. There's no evidence to back it up when you look at the actual reality of what's happening in the world versus what is claimed to be happening or will happen in the world. And focus has been on the computer models, which David and I have discussed have been skewed and screwed up, but they can't possibly handle all the factors that are involved in changing our climate and our weather on a daily and weekly and century basis. And yet they narrow down the number of factors. They ignore the sun and many other natural forces. So we need to take another really hard look, because that is the foundation of all of this analysis that claims humans have suddenly taken over control of the climate. Related to that, my second one is an analysis of wind, solar, battery, and biofuel technologies and the impacts that they actually have on the environment for very poor, intermittent, unreliable, expensive energy. So those are my top two.
Excellent. David, what would you recommend?
Well, I would like to see a policy or a law or something that said that policy cannot be based on computer models until they have been properly assessed and vindicated and verified. As simple as that. Mm-hmm. In any agency, this would be government-wide. This would not just the environmental area.
I've got a question for you two gentlemen, if Dan doesn't mind.
Sure, come on.
A quick question. Okay, when we see some of the things that we've seen problems in the DOJ, we've seen problems in the FBI, we've seen problems in all of these ABC departments of our government, the CDC when it comes to this coronavirus, the EPA when it comes to the things that you were just discussing, Paul, and you too, David. Could we have gotten to a point where all of our ABC departments of the government need to be reined in and limited back to constitutional duties that are spelled out by the Constitution?
Sure. Yeah, but can we get the voice back?
Well, I mean, it's getting the genie back in the bottle, but for crying out loud.
If we could get a Congress that was willing to cut spending, then we could eliminate a lot of this stuff. Okay, but Trump's budgets have been ignored. Congress just throwing more money at the government all the time to produce, which is generating scares more than anything. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've got to stop the money. Stop the money machine. Yeah, the green machine. I mean, but across all these different issues, that would be a big part of it. Mm-hmm.
Drain the swamp. If he gets another 4 years and isn't dogged every step of the way with another impeachment, this one over coronavirus or something else, and he gets people confirmed, then a lot can happen. And we've already got one house of Congress that refuses to come back. The Senate is sort of there, but not there. So maybe he can go ahead and declare that Congress is out of session for a couple of weeks, and he's going to get all his recess appointments in that way, because he's had a hard time getting the people in there that he needs to carry through on some of these campaign promises. But I have to give him credit. He's come through on more campaign promises than vast number of recent presidents have.
No, he has, and the fact that he's done it in spite of such overwhelming odds against him, it's pretty amazing, really.
And lightning speed when you're talking about how quickly things move in Washington, D.C.
I mean, look at the predictions for what the stock market and the economy were going to do if you listen to Paul Crump and his ilk right after the election versus what happened right up until COVID hit this United States. Incredible. And if we can unleash those animal forces of free enterprise, entrepreneurial capitalism once again, we're going to be in good shape again.
I agree. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, very quickly, we've just got about a minute left. David, talk about the work you do, and very quickly, and then we'll give Paul a chance to talk.
I got nothing.
Oh, you got nothing. Well, you write for CFACT. You do a lot of great articles for CFACT.
Yeah. No, I've mentioned a couple of things I'm looking at, and I'm going to be all over this COVID thing. And I'm trying to figure out, strategies things that we can do to make things better, so these kinds of panics don't happen again.
Good. Well, great having you, and thank you for being here. Paul, very quickly, talk a little bit about the stuff you're doing, and
much the same, Dan. Books, articles, radio shows, TV, and so forth, all along the same lines. A little bit on COVID, climate, environmentalism, human rights around the world. And find my stuff on townhall.com, cfact.org, what's up with that, various other places. So keep doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's always a great pleasure. And with that, it looks like Patrick Howley is ready to start the campaign show. Patrick, thank you, and have a great program. Gentlemen, thank you again, and join us next week for Connecting Some Dots.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand.